What's up, Barnhill family, and welcome back to your home for all things combat sports.
Yo.
So, Nick, after 2 years of negotiation with the UFC, Francis Ngannou is now officially the biggest free agent in MMA right now. But the question is, where's he going to end up?
Well, there's a lot of good places for him to go after seeing him be released from the UFC, relinquish that belt, which is literally the most coveted belt in all of combat sports. It tells us that Ngannou is mostly prioritizing becoming the biggest prize fighter he can be. He wants to make the money. It's clear to me that he didn't really care about, the legacy of being the greatest heavyweight of all time when you walk away from the UFC as the champion in the heavyweight division. So there are some big matchups, but they're few and far between.
It seems like that to me as well. Dana White also said in the press conference after the first UFC fight night of 23 that there would be, under no circumstances, a boxing provision in his contract. And I think that's what he wanted. Not only did he want more money on the pay-per-view side and a higher percentage of the split on the pay-per-view side, I think he also wanted a carve-out within the contract that allowed him to go out and box. And Dana said that that was not something that they were willing to budge on in the negotiation. He said Hunter Campbell went to over 300 dinners with Francis over the last 2 years. Now, I don't know if it was quite that many because that would be him having dinner with Francis pretty much every other night, and I doubt that Hunter Campbell was doing that. But suffice it to say that the UFC put a lot of time and effort into trying to re-sign Francis, and Dana went as far as to say that Francis just simply didn't want to fight the best. And he said, at 35 years old now, having come off knee surgery, he didn't want to take the risk in fighting the best fighter of all time, who is John Jones, and potentially losing and his stock falling, and especially with no contract ready to save him if he were to fall and suffer a loss. So he basically said, look, he wants to go make a ton of money and fight lesser opponents, and so we're not going to get in his way. There's going to be no contract stipulations. There's going to be no match, which normally there would be if an offer was made to a fighter. The UFC would get the first right of refusal to match or better that offer before the fighter was relinquished. Dana said, we're not doing any of that. There's no strings attached. Francis is welcome to go wherever he wants. So I think that he's going to end up at the PFL, and here's why. The PFL just signed Jake Paul. Jake Paul hates Dana White. Jake Paul would love nothing more than to steal one of the UFC's biggest name fighters, and short of taking Conor McGregor, Francis Ngannou is kind of it. On top of that, Jake is working with the PFL to create the, quote, super fight division. Now, we don't have a lot of details on what that's going to look like, but essentially, the gist of it is this. 50% of all of the pay-per-view revenue is going to be split with the fighters who compete in that super fight division. So Francis Ngannou wants to make a lot more on the pay-per-view side. There's the answer to that. He wants to fight, quote, lesser opponents, as Dana White says. Well, the PFL's heavyweight division, you and I are diehard MMA fans. I probably couldn't name you 5 heavyweights on PFL's roster right now. So suffice it to say that the competition in PFL's heavyweight division is nowhere near that of John Jones, Cyril Gane, and the rest of the heavyweights in the UFC. Third, I think that the PFL will absolutely carve out a place in the contract for Francis to go box and still be a PFL fighter.
For sure. Bellator has done that. We saw Michael Venom Page box Mike Perry not that long ago. And so these organizations are more than happy to co-promote with other MMA organizations as well as let their fighters go do other things. And I think that's cool. If that's what you're into, that's fine. The UFC does kind of like to separate themselves from everybody else, not just in MMA, but in all of combat sports. And I think that's cool as well. It sort of does set the UFC belts away from all the other ones. And it does make it seem like it's a little bit more of a prestigious title to own. But I think you're right about the PFL because with Jake Paul being announced, that means the PFL is trying to make a big play to become one of the name brands in all of mixed martial arts. Jake Paul is a thorn in Dana's side, and if he can pull any of these fighters out and start to, create a little league inside of the PFL, he'll absolutely do that. The only thing that is a little bit strange to me about signing with the PFL and going into these super fights is when I think super fights, I think of 2 massive names, 2 massive stars, 2 big people in the sport going at it to compete. And Francis Ngannou is a star. Let's not mistake that. He is a well-known person throughout the world, but it is very difficult to get into that level of such a star that it doesn't matter who you fight, people are going to tune in. I don't think Francis is there. I mean, his numbers from the pay-per-views that he did with the UFC sort of reflect that he's not quite that kind of a star yet. Now with taking himself out of the UFC, he doesn't have the potential to become that kind of star by getting wins over people like, John Jones and some of the other top 5 heavyweights in the UFC, and really cementing himself as one of the GOATs of the heavyweight division. So while I do think he could make 50% of the pay-per-view that the PFL is trying to give him, and that sounds great, 50% of not a very good selling pay-per-view might not even be as much money as what the UFC was giving him when they were giving him significantly less than 50% of the pay-per-view as the champ. So for me, I think it's going to be tough for him to find names that are big enough for people to care about, that are going to, bring the numbers that he thinks they're going to bring. And, if they start putting Jake Paul in on these cards and they can really beef up the Super Fight League pay-per-view cards, maybe we're talking about some serious money. But at this point, I don't think there's enough big names outside of the UFC's heavyweight division for Francis to fight. He'd have to go over to boxing and maybe do a fight with Tyson Fury or AJ or Deontay Wilder, one of these types of fighters, to really get some sort of action drumming up. But even still, I don't think those are as big of fights as what the UFC could offer.
I agree, and actually I think that Francis's most compelling and most exciting fights outside of the UFC are boxing fights, because there are some divisions, right? Bellator's 145 division is really good. You got Pitbull, you got AJ McKee, you've got people that could legitimately make a case that they could contend with the top 5, top 10 in the UFC. Heavyweight's not one of those divisions. The best heavyweights in the world compete under the UFC banner, and it's not even really by a close margin. The heavyweight divisions and other organizations are kind of propped up by 1 or 2 people like, Fedor, for example, in Bellator, but Fedor is well past his prime. I don't see any situation where Fedor would fight Francis, or that there would even be an appetite for that at this point in time. So I think the biggest fights are the ones that could be made in boxing, and I think PFL will allow him to do that. So I think to some degree he'd be willing to sacrifice exciting fights on the MMA side just to have that carve out to do boxing against somebody like an AJ, a Wilder, or a Fury. And it's a unique time in boxing because you have those 3 big names that are all heavyweight punchers. Obviously Tyson's very technically skilled, but Wilder's one of the best knockout artists that the division has ever seen. To put him and Francis together in a boxing ring, that would do big numbers. AJ's fallen on some tough times lately, but people love Anthony Joshua. He's still a big star. Joshua versus Francis would be a big mega fight. So I think more than anything, it was this boxing carve-out that made the difference.
It for sure would. And I think, even people like AJ and Deontay Wilder, if enough money's getting thrown at them and, maybe the Middle East wants to host an event, you could have a boxing match where they're wearing MMA gloves. That's kind of what he was talking to Tyson Fury about at one point. Some sort of a spectacle that's not pure boxing and not pure MMA. That might be where he lands when he goes with some of these boxers, because at this point, a guy who really doesn't have a boxing career versus the best 3 or 4 heavyweights in the world is a bit of a tough sell, because most people would just assume he'd go in there and lose. I think that might be the direction that Francis winds up going, and who knows what's going to happen. I do think that the plot thickens at heavyweight across the board from all combat sports, but I'm excited to see what happens. And the UFC is going to continue on. They're going to crown another champion soon after this, and I think the ball will continue to roll for them, and who knows where Francis' ball is going to roll.
Time will tell. Thanks for watching this video, guys. We're your hub for all things combat sports. If that's your jam, we appreciate a subscribe and a like on the video, and drop us a comment down below. We'll see you next time.
Peace.